The sun had barely begun to break the edge of the horizon, casting long golden blades of light across the cracked earth. It was the kind of morning that came without warmth, where the wind cut like glass and the sky above looked too big for one soul to carry alone. Dust drifted slow and silent across the trail, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out above the empty desert. From that emptiness came a sound that didn't belong. "Sir, do you know the way to heaven?" A child's voice, small, worn thin by wind and worry. "My mama went there," she added, her voice shaking just before her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the dirt. Nahuel pulled the reins hard, his horse snorting and stamping the sand. For a long second he didn't move, just stared down at the heap of faded blue cloth and bones too small to be walking this far alone. His painted face was still, unreadable, but something old stirred beneath the silence he'd worn for years like armor. He climbed down. The girl had fallen sideways, her hand clutching a torn shawl around her shoulders. Her lips were cracked, her shoes too big. One heel was missing. Her cheeks were sunburned and streaked with dried tears. But it was her eyes that broke through his guard when they fluttered open and looked up at him like he was the last truth left in the world. "Please," she whispered, "I can't find her on my own." Nahuel didn't answer, not with words. He picked her up like she was made of smoke and glass, light as nothing and trembling all over. She didn't resist, didn't even blink, just laid her head against his chest, the blue shawl slipping off her shoulder as her eyes fell shut again. He mounted his horse with her in his arms and turned toward the trees where a shallow creek still whispered through cottonwoods, one of the few places left untouched by the winter's cruelty. They rode in silence. Her small frame sagged against him, breath coming in shallow, fading waves. And all the while, Nahuel kept his gaze on the horizon ahead, not trusting himself to look down at the child who had just cracked open a heart he thought had long turned to stone. The grove where he made camp was quiet, half-shadowed by ancient trees, the stream moving slow over river stones. He laid the girl beside the water, fetched his canteen, and tipped a few drops past her lips. Her eyes fluttered open again, startled and cloudy. She coughed once, then drank greedily. "You're safe," Nahuel said softly. His voice was deep and ragged, like wind on stone. She studied him, blinking. "You came back." He didn't understand at first. "In my dream," she whispered. "You had paint on your face." "But your eyes were kind." Nahuel sat back on his heels and looked at the water instead of her. The cold ran deeper than the stream. "Drink more." Slowly she obeyed, taking careful sips while watching him. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. "No." "But you got a horse and a gun. And you're big like one?" He didn't answer. After a long silence, she offered him a name. "Lucy." He nodded. "Nahuel." She tried sitting up but winced. Her legs were blistered and raw beneath her dress, which had once been pale blue but was now stained with dust and travel. "You got a mama?" she asked, voice small. "I did. Mine died. Fever. They buried her under the oak tree near the well." His jaw tightened. "My auntie didn't want me after. Said I eat too much and talk too much and cry at night." Lucy's voice dropped. "So I left. I didn't steal nothing, just took bread and Mama's shawl. This one," she clutched the frayed fabric tighter. Nahuel stood, walked a few paces, and returned with a piece of jerky. She accepted it with both hands like it was sacred. "You came far?" 3 days, maybe 4. She paused. "I followed the road 'cause I thought heaven might be that way. Mama said good people go there when they die. So if I got there, maybe she'd see me again." Nahuel didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than the wind in the trees. "I don't know the way to heaven." Lucy looked down at the jerky, chewing slower now. That's okay. Maybe you can take me close. By nightfall, Lucy was sleeping under a blanket near the fire. Her breath had evened out and color was returning to her cheeks. Nahuel sat watch, sharpening his knife in slow, steady strokes. The fire crackled, but his thoughts were louder. 3 years, 3 winters since soldiers had burned his village, taken his daughter. She'd been about Lucy's age, hair dark like hers, eyes full of spark and softness. He had searched for months, found nothing but ash and graves. Since then, he hadn't stopped moving, hadn't stopped blaming himself. He avoided people, settlements, even his own kind. There was nothing left for him in this world but silence. Until now. Until a girl with blistered feet and a broken voice asked him the one question he'd never been able to answer. The next morning, Lucy awoke to the smell of stew. A small rabbit had been caught, roots boiled in a battered tin pot. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "You cook good for a man." Nahuel allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch. She crawled closer to the fire. "Will you take me to town now?" "Santa Rosa's 3 days' ride. We'll leave after breakfast. Will they help me there?" "They'll feed you." "Maybe find you a place." Lucy went quiet. Then, in a whisper, "Will you stay?" He looked at her, at the child wrapped in her mother's shawl, who had walked through desert and grief to ask a stranger about heaven. "I'll make sure you get there safe." She nodded like that was enough. They ate in silence. The wind picked up, sending gold leaves scattering across the grove. The stream babbled like it had stories of its own. When they mounted his horse and turned toward the trail north, Lucy asked again, softly, "Are you taking me to heaven?" Nahuel didn't turn his head, just spoke low and sure. "Not yet," he said, "but I'll get you close." And behind them the blue shawl fluttered in the wind like a memory that refused to fade. The trail toward Santa Rosa stretched like a ribbon of dust between low hills and scrub. The air was dry, but the sun had softened by mid-afternoon, and the wind carried the scent of juniper and old mesquite. Nahuel rode in silence, as he often did, the little girl tucked snug against his chest, her hands gripping the worn leather of his vest. Lucy had stopped asking questions for a while. Her body was still weak from days without enough food, and sleep came easy under the steady rhythm of the horse's steps. But now and again she stirred and murmured something that tugged at him. "My mama used to hum when she brushed my hair," she whispered once. She'd sing real soft, like the wind in the tall grass. Nahuel didn't answer. He rarely did. But his hand shifted gently, adjusting her shawl when the breeze lifted it off her shoulder. After they made camp that night near an old cottonwood grove, Lucy perked up, sitting cross-legged near the fire as she nibbled at the stew he'd made. The rabbit had been scrawny, but she ate like it was the finest roast in a saloon kitchen. "Do you got a little girl?" she asked, licking her fingers. "You look like someone who used to." He didn't look at her, just tossed another stick onto the flames and watched the sparks lift into the night. "I did," he said finally. Lucy blinked, then lowered her voice. "Where is she now?" He turned to the fire, his face unreadable. "Taken." The word dropped between them like a stone in a still creek. "By soldiers?" He nodded once. Lucy stared into the flames. "Was she my age?" "A little younger." "Did she have a name?" He hesitated. "Tala. It means wolf." "That's a strong name," Lucy whispered. "I like it." They sat quiet for a long while, the kind of quiet that only comes when two people carry too much grief to speak it all aloud. Finally, Lucy reached over and touched his hand. "I bet she loved you." Nahuel looked at her for a long moment, then reached for the pot and ladled her a second helping. They reached Santa Rosa on the 3rd morning. The town was small, little more than a string of buildings along the main road, with a church on the far end and a bell tower that rose like a finger pointing to heaven. Lucy's eyes lit up at the sight of it. That's where they help people, right? Churches? Sometimes. They left the horse tied near the well and walked the final stretch on foot. Nahuel's wide frame drew stares, though most folks quickly looked away. There was something about the way he moved, quiet, solid, watchful, that made men lower their eyes and mothers pull children close. Inside the adobe church, the air was cool and smelled faintly of candles and old wood. Father Miguel looked up from his papers when they entered. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and hands calloused from labor, not ceremony. Nahuel nodded once. She needs food, rest, a place safe. The priest stepped forward and crouched to Lucy's level. "What's your name, child?" "Lucy Johnson," she replied softly. "I'm 6. I think Father Miguel smiled gently. "You think?" "I stopped counting after Mama died." The priest's face changed. He stood slowly and motioned them toward a bench. They talked for an hour. Lucy sat nearby, sipping broth and humming to herself. Nahuel told the truth, but not all of it. He said he found her wandering, half dead. He said she'd been mistreated by kin. He said he thought the church could help. And Father Miguel, for his part, asked few questions. Perhaps he'd seen enough hardship to know when truth wore different clothes. But near the end of their conversation, the priest cleared his throat. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. Lucy's aunt filed a report. Said the girl was taken by force, by an Indian. Nahuel didn't move, but something in his face went still, like water freezing midstream. "She said she fears for the girl's soul," the priest continued. "The sheriff believes her. There are men ranch hands and a few bounty riders asking questions. Someone saw you riding with a child. Your name's not known here, but your face—" He didn't finish the sentence. Nahuel rose slowly. Lucy looked up from her cup. "Are we leaving already?" Father Miguel stepped forward. "You can't take her. Not now. If they see you ride out with her, they'll assume the worst." Nahuel said nothing. He walked to the window and stared out at the street. Dust swirled. A man with a rifle leaned against a post across the way, not watching directly, but close enough. Lucy had followed him to the window. She tugged his vest. "Do I have to stay here?" He looked down at her, at the child who had walked through grief and sunburn just to find heaven. Her cheeks were flushed now, her eyes clearer, but her fingers still trembled. "If I stay," she said, "will they let me write you?" Nahuel looked at Father Miguel. "No letters," the priest said softly. "Not for a while. It'd be dangerous for both of you." Nahuel turned back to Lucy. She was biting her lower lip, trying not to cry. She was too proud for that, too tough. But he saw the tears anyway, and something inside him broke open again. "No," he said. He crouched down. "Get your shawl, Lucy." Father Miguel stepped between them. "You can't just—" But Nahuel was already moving, lifting the girl into his arms. He tossed a coin onto the table, more than enough for the broth and bread. "If they follow," he said, "they'll regret it." And just like that, they were gone. By dusk, they were 10 miles north of Santa Rosa, riding through dry gullies and broken sage. Lucy was quiet, her head resting against his chest again. Nahuel hadn't spoken in over an hour. His jaw was clenched, eyes scanning the hills. Finally, Lucy spoke. "You were gonna leave me." He didn't answer. "But you didn't." He shook his head. She looked up at him. "Why not?" He looked out across the open land. "Because your aunt lied, and because sometimes the world will find any excuse to hang a man like me." Lucy was quiet for a beat. "I'm glad you didn't leave." Then she asked, "Where are we going now?" Nahuel didn't have a clear answer. Not yet. North, maybe, to where the land stretched wide and the law didn't reach so quick. But the part that twisted him wasn't where they were going. It was the realization that somewhere between her first question and that broth in Santa Rosa, this had stopped being about duty. He glanced down at the girl in the shawl, now sleeping softly, and thought about another child with dark eyes lost to time. She stirred in her sleep and mumbled something. He leaned closer. She was dreaming again, dreaming of heaven. But Nahuel knew now she wasn't trying to reach it. She was trying to rebuild it, piece by piece, with whoever was willing to stay. And that night, as the stars wheeled overhead and coyotes sang in the distance, Nahuel leaned against a cold rock and whispered the truth aloud for no one but the dark. I wasn't supposed to care. From the shadow of the trees behind them, a rider watched. Not close enough to be seen. Not yet. But he would be. Soon. The storm didn't come gradually. It swept down from the mountains like a fury uncoiled thunder, rolling like wagon wheels over stone, wind-bending trees in violent prayer, and rain so heavy it turned the dirt trail into soup beneath the horses' hooves. Nahuel pulled his hat low and tightened his grip on Lucy, who clung to him beneath her soaked shawl, her small face pressed into his chest. They'd been riding for miles, staying off the main roads and sleeping rough, always moving, always listening. But this storm gave no warning and demanded no permission. "There!" Lucy shouted over the roar, pointing with a trembling hand. Through the veil of rain, Nahuel saw it too. A dark, angular silhouette rising from the edge of a hill, a crumbling church, long abandoned, walls cracked, roof half caved in, but still standing like a stubborn prayer no one had answered in years. He urged the horse forward. The wind ripped at them as they approached the building. Nahuel swung off the saddle and lifted Lucy down, shielding her from the worst of the rain as they made their way inside. The doors hung crooked, and the interior smelled of rot and ash, but it was dry. Mostly. Nahuel lowered Lucy onto a patch of broken pews and pulled off his duster. The fire pit in the center of the room was old, but not dead. Someone had used this place recently. Then they heard the sound, a soft rustling, the unmistakable rhythm of cloth being folded. A shape moved in the far corner of the sanctuary, lit by the flicker of a small fire nearly out. Nahuel reached for the knife at his belt. Lucy shrank behind him. "It's just me," came a woman's voice, low and calm. She stepped into the light. Late 20s, maybe, with thick dark hair pulled into a braid and a face that had known too much sun and not enough kindness. Her dress was patched in several places, and her boots were worn at the toes. A belt knife rested at her side, though her hands were raised in peace. "I saw the storm," Nahuel said flatly. She nodded. "So did I. Been watching it crawl over the hills since morning." Lucy peeked out from behind him. The woman smiled gently. "You're soaked," she said. "There's room enough for all of us." Nahuel didn't lower his guard, but he didn't move forward either. "You alone?" he asked. The woman nodded. "For now." And hoping to stay that way, something in her tone wasn't fear. It was bone-deep exhaustion. Familiar. They entered the space cautiously. Nahuel fed the fire with twigs and dry bark from a corner pile, while Lucy wrapped herself in the blue shawl and sat close to the warmth. "I'm Dora," the woman said finally. "Dora Miller." "Lucy," the girl replied. "And he's Nahuel." Dora's eyes flicked to him. "Apache?" He nodded. She didn't flinch. "Well, Apache or not, you build a good fire. And you don't leave little girls to drown in storms. That's good enough for me." They shared a stew that night, dried beans and scraps of smoked meat Dora had been carrying in her satchel. It wasn't much, but with rain hammering the roof and thunder shaking the walls, It tasted better than any feast. Lucy curled up near the fire and dozed, her head on Nahuel's coat. Dora sat on the floor, sewing a tear in her sleeve with steady hands. "You running?" Nahuel asked, breaking the silence. She didn't look up. "Isn't everybody?" He didn't press, but after a moment, she spoke again. "My mother was Mexican. My father, Irish, or so I'm told, he was a trader, came up from Texas with silver dreams and a weakness for cards. Died when I was 7. Nahuel listened without comment. The storm howled beyond the broken windows. I was promised to a merchant in Albuquerque. Rich, well-respected, 22 years older than me. Eyes like a butcher's scale, always weighing, never seeing. You left? Ran. Morning of the wedding. Took nothing but this dress and a broken ring. Nahuel studied her face. She wasn't soft. She'd slept outside, fought off things bigger than wolves. But her voice had the tremble of someone who wasn't used to telling her story aloud. "He's still looking?" he asked. Dora nodded. "Put out a reward." Enough to make bounty hunters circle like buzzards. Lucy stirred beside them, murmuring something in her sleep. "She's strong," Dora said softly. "She walked 3 days before I found her," Nahuel said. "Looking for heaven." Dora looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And what did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know the way." Dora stared into the flames. "None of us do." There was silence between them for a while. Not cold, not tense, just quiet. The kind that comes when 2 wounded animals happen to find the same cave in a storm. Later, as Dora braided Lucy's damp hair with gentle fingers and hummed an old tune from her childhood, Nahuel sat on the other side of the fire, sharpening his blade, eyes flicking to the door now and then. Watching, waiting. "You don't talk much," Dora said over her shoulder. "Words are like food," he said. "Use too many. You run out." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe people like us already ran out once. Now we only speak when it matters." Nahuel didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said she was closer to the truth than she knew. In the early hours, when the rain softened to a whisper and the wind had worn itself down to a tired sigh, Lucy sat up and looked across the embers toward Nahuel. "Can she come with us?" she asked sleepily. Nahuel met Dora's gaze. She held it, waiting. There was no plea in her eyes, no begging. Just a tired offer. "I don't want to be alone anymore." He didn't speak right away, but then he gave one small nod. Outside, the last clap of thunder echoed through the hills, like a door closing on something behind them. And just beyond the reach of firelight, another pair of eyes blinked in the dark. Someone who'd seen the horse tied outside. Someone who'd been following Nahuel since Santa Rosa, waiting for the right moment to strike. The town of Cedar Falls appeared just past a bend in the river, nestled between 2 hills dotted with pine. It wasn't much, maybe 30 buildings total, but it had what they needed. A general store, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith, and a church with peeling white paint that looked like it hadn't seen a brush since the war ended. It also had the most important thing: no sheriff. Just a part-time lawman who mostly settled disputes over fence lines and missing chickens. That was good enough. Nahuel pulled the horse to a stop just outside town. Dora shifted behind him in the saddle, Lucy riding in front. For a moment, the 3 of them stared down the main street in silence. It felt like holding their breath after months of running. Dora was the first to speak. "Looks quiet," she said. "Too quiet?" Lucy asked, her voice muffled beneath her shawl. Nahuel looked at her, then at the road ahead. "Let's find work. Then we'll see." They didn't go in pretending to be something they weren't. They had a story, simple and soft around the edges. A widower with a wife and child looking for honest labor. Nahuel said little, but the townfolk weren't used to seeing Apache men riding in with families and no weapons drawn. Suspicion simmered beneath the surface, but no one said much. Not at first. Dora found work in the seamstress shop of an old woman named Mrs. Lindell, who had a bad back and shaky fingers but a sharp eye for fabric. Dora's hands were quick, her stitches clean. Before long, she was fixing Sunday coats and altering wedding dresses. Nahuel took a job at the livery, where he helped repair stalls and clean out the back paddocks. The stable owner, a round man named Vern Talley, didn't care much for conversation, which suited Nahuel just fine. He kept his head down, worked hard, and never asked for more than what he earned. And Lucy started school. She wore a dress Dora had mended 3 times and shoes still too big, but she walked into the one-room schoolhouse on her first morning like she owned the place. By the end of the week, she had a friend named Emma, a girl with curly blonde hair and 2 missing teeth, and had memorized the first 10 lines of the alphabet song. Life began to settle into something dangerously close to peace. At night, they returned to the small rental cabin behind the churchyard. Dora would cook beans with salt pork if they had it, or make biscuits when flour was cheap. Nahuel taught Lucy to whittle sticks into animal shapes. Sometimes Dora sang while she sewed. The fire cracked and popped while wind moved through the cottonwoods outside. "I like it here," Lucy said one night, her voice sleepy as she curled against Dora beneath a quilt. "Feels like we ain't running." Dora smiled faintly. "Me too, sweetheart." Me too, but peace, as they knew too well, didn't last. It started with a letter. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolmaster's wife, was folding clean linens at the back of the classroom when she overheard Lucy reciting a story about her mama. Something in the girl's phrasing, back when she was still alive, set off a strange tug in the woman's chest. That night she went home and dug through her drawer of correspondence. Weeks ago, her sister in Santa Rosa had sent a clipped letter from the town paper. "Missing child, female, age 6, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen near the Johnson farm, suspected abducted by native party." The words on the page didn't match the gentle child she saw drawing horses and sounding out vowels. But suspicion is a fire easily stoked in dry places. She waited, watched. A week later, she walked into the livery where Nahuel was patching a broken fence rail. "She's not your daughter," Mrs. Patterson said without greeting. Nahuel paused mid-swing of his hammer. "What makes you say that?" She flinches when someone speaks too loud. She doesn't know her own birthday. And she talks about her mama like she's a ghost. Nahuel looked back down at the rail, but she wasn't finished. "My husband won't say a word, but the blacksmith already told 3 men he saw a red-skinned man riding in with a white girl and a foreign woman. It won't take long before someone says something to the wrong person. You need to leave." Tonight, Nahuel didn't reply, but he didn't need to. His eyes told her he understood exactly what she meant. That evening, he returned to the cabin with heavy boots, and a silence Dora felt the second he opened the door. She looked up from the stove. "What happened?" "We've been seen," he said. Dora didn't need the details. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to pack. Lucy was on the porch, cradling a wooden sparrow Nahuel had carved. She looked up as he stepped out into the fading light. "We in trouble again?" He crouched beside her. "Maybe." "But we're not alone." Lucy nodded, eyes wide but dry. "Okay." They moved quickly. Dora packed the few coins they had, dried food, a small knife, sewing thread, and Lucy's shawl. Nahuel readied the horse, checking its hooves by lantern light. Just past midnight, they slipped out the back of the town without a sound. The streets were still, but shadows moved behind curtained windows, and somewhere near the churchyard, a man lit a cigarette with hands that trembled just slightly and whispered to the dark, "Told you he'd run." He watched their silhouettes ride into the night, smoke curling from his lips, and turned to saddle his own horse, not to stop them, to follow. The moon hung low over the scrubland, casting long silver shadows across the dry creek beds and twisted juniper trees. They'd ridden all night and most of the day, avoiding roads, crossing shallow ravines, doubling back twice to throw off any possible tail. Nahuel could feel the tension riding up his spine like cold water. Something was wrong. Too quiet. No distant hooves, no night birds. Just a silence too deep to be natural. "Don't like this stretch," he muttered, slowing the horse. Dora, riding beside him, kept her hand near the bag slung across her saddle inside, a small knife and a stitched pouch of coins. Lucy rode with her, arms wrapped tight around Dora's waist, head resting on her back. They came out of a narrow pass into a wider basin, ringed with rocks. That's when it happened. 6 riders burst from the shadows, 3 on either side, rifles raised. No warning, no questions, just precision. Nahuel barely had time to pull Lucy down from the saddle before a thick-shouldered man tackled him from behind. Dora shouted, kicked, bit, but a second man grabbed her by the braid and wrenched her from her horse. Lucy screamed. Nahuel fought like a wounded bear, swinging and thrashing, but 6 men had come prepared. They had ropes, irons, shackles, and orders. It was over in minutes. Lucy was yanked from Nahuel's arms by a man with a red scarf covering half his face. He passed her to another rider who held her too tight, ignoring her cries. "She's mine!" Nahuel bellowed, struggling against the chains being thrown around his wrists. "She ain't yours," one of the men snarled. "She's a white girl, and you're gonna hang for taking her." Dora, hands bound, her face scraped from the fall, shouted, "We didn't take her!" She ran from her kin, but no one listened. The men weren't here for truth. They were here for the bounty. Nahuel was forced to his knees, blood running from a split above his brow. Lucy's cries were fading into the distance as her captor turned his horse and rode hard south. Dora was shoved onto another mount, tethered like livestock. The last thing Nahuel saw before the cloth was tied over his face was Lucy reaching for him. "Please don't leave me." The words cut sharper than any knife. The trial happened the next day in a dusty town whose name Nahuel never bothered to ask. He stood shackled in a makeshift courtroom while a man in a judge's coat droned through accusations like reading from a grocery list. Kidnapping, theft, conspiracy. No one asked Lucy what had happened. No one asked Dora. No one questioned why a man who had kidnapped a child hadn't once tried to run when confronted. They saw an Apache with a white child, and that was enough. The sentence was death. Hanging. At sunset. No appeal. No delay. By mid-afternoon, Nahuel sat in a damp jail cell built more to hold drunk farmhands than seasoned warriors. He counted the cracks in the walls and listened to the guards outside laughing over cards and cheap whiskey. One of them mentioned a reward, then something about shipping Dora back to her husband. That was the only time Nahuel's hands trembled. He waited until the light shifted and the guards grew lazy. That was when he heard it, a soft bird call from beyond the far wall. A signal. The back of the jail wasn't as secure as the front. It was adobe, old, crumbling at the corners. And Nahuel hadn't spent his life surviving ambushes and war just to die in a rat cage. When the guard nearest him nodded off, he slipped the hidden shard of metal from his boot, the one they hadn't found, and began working at the corner brick. Minutes later, 2 shadows dropped into the corridor from the roof, Apache warriors, lean and silent, eyes sharp as glass. They didn't speak, just handed him a knife and a bow. The escape was swift and brutal. 2 guards fell before they ever saw the blades. Nahuel moved like a man possessed, weaving through alleys, dodging torches, until he reached the livery. His horse was already saddled. His brothers had prepared everything, but he didn't ride north. He turned south. They reached the orphanage just after midnight, a cold gray building surrounded by a stone wall and lit with oil lamps that glowed like eyes. Inside, Lucy sat alone on a hard bench in the dining hall, her hands folded, eyes empty. The women who ran the place had scrubbed her skin raw and dressed her in a stiff wool uniform. She hadn't spoken since arriving. When the back door burst open, revealing Nahuel's painted face and the glint of steel, the nuns screamed. Children fled beneath tables, but Lucy didn't move. "I knew you'd come," she said as he lifted her into his arms. He carried her out into the night, shielding her from the cold and the shouting behind them. By the time the town stirred, they were already gone. Dora was harder. She was held in the town jail, guarded by 3 men with rifles and a sense of purpose. Nahuel approached from the rear, slipping through the darkness like a shadow with a heartbeat. His brothers created the diversion fire set to a hay cart, then gunshots in the air. The guards scrambled. Nahuel slipped through a side window, silent as breath. Dora was chained to the bench, eyes swollen but burning with fury. "Took you long enough," she whispered. He grinned. They didn't speak again until they were halfway out of town, riding double through the creek bed, Lucy tucked between them, clutching Dora's waist like it was the only thing holding her to the world. They rode hard and deep into the timbered hills, not stopping until the sun began to paint the sky with bruised light. Lucy finally spoke. "Are we safe now?" Nahuel looked out at the forest, quiet for now. But he knew what came next. The kind of escape they'd just pulled off would echo. It would spread. It would provoke a hunt that wouldn't stop until blood was spilled. He tightened his grip on the reins. "Not yet," he said, "but we ride together now." All of us. Dora looked back over her shoulder. "Then we'd better not slow down." Behind them, at the edge of the forest, smoke curled into the air. Not from their fire, from a signal. Someone had already found the empty jail, found the guards, found the trail, and this time the ones coming for them wouldn't be bounty hunters. They'd be soldiers. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting the land in long shadows and gold light that turned to ash as the evening fell. The smell of dust and pine clung to the air, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a night bird, felt sharper, too close, too full of warning. They'd been riding for 6 days since the escape, 6 days of avoiding every road, sleeping in arroyos and canyons, crossing rivers barefoot with the horses tied behind them, never lighting a fire. They were hunted now not just by bounty men but by lawmen and federal riders who didn't ask questions first. Nahuel rode at the front, always watching. His face had grown harder, thinner, a shadow of the man who once carved wooden birds for a little girl. Dora followed behind, keeping Lucy close in the saddle, whispering songs and stories when the child's eyes grew too tired to stay open. It was the 7th night when the rain came. Not a hard downpour, but a cold, steady mist that soaked them through and turned the trail slick. They found shelter beneath a rock overhang, barely deep enough for all 3 to curl up together. Nahuel tied the horses under a thick stand of cedar nearby and returned to sit against the stone wall, his rifle across his knees. Lucy sat beside Dora, wrapped in a blanket and still shivering. "Do you think they're still chasing us?" she asked. Dora didn't answer right away. She looked to Nahuel, who didn't move. "They won't stop," he said finally. Lucy was quiet for a moment, staring at her boots. "Are we always going to run?" The words dropped like stones into the silence. Dora blinked. Her mouth opened, but she couldn't find anything to say. Nahuel looked at Lucy. Really looked. Her face was thinner than before, her cheeks hollowed out, but her eyes, those wide brown eyes, still held fire, still held hope. And for the first time in a long time, he realized how unfair that hope had become. He didn't answer. Not yet. The rain tapped against the stone like impatient fingers. Lucy turned and leaned into Dora's side. Dora wrapped her arms around the girl, then looked across the small space to Nahuel. "I never meant to keep it from you," she said softly. He frowned. "Keep what?" She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. The edges were soft from travel, the seal cracked and faded. "This. Reverend Thompson gave it to me before I ran. He said if anything happened to him, if I ever felt truly cornered, to take it to the authorities in Santa Fe." Nahuel leaned forward, water dripping from his hat brim. He took the envelope carefully and turned it in his hands. "What is it?" "Evidence," Dora said, "about land grants, about forged claims and bribes. My father knew about it. He worked as a clerk, and when he refused to help them falsify records, he disappeared. Thompson believed he was killed for what he wouldn't sign." Nahuel's fingers tensed around the paper. "They stole land from Apache families," she continued, "used forged titles to take it all, especially when they found silver in the hills. This letter, it names names, including the man who tried to marry me. He was part of it." Nahuel's voice was low. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I was scared. Of what it meant, of what it would cost. Does Lucy know?" "No. But maybe she should." Lucy was already asleep, tucked into Dora's lap, her breath slow and steady. Nahuel stared into the rain. For a long time, the only sound was water hitting stone and the distant rustle of wind through pine. "We've been surviving," he said finally, "but that's all we've done. Run. Hide." Pretend Dora didn't interrupt. She let him speak, let him weigh each word like iron on a scale. "They took my daughter," he said, voice tightening. "Took her, burned our home, called us savages and thieves. And I stayed quiet, until I found this girl in the dust, asking how to get to heaven." He looked down at Lucy, still asleep. "I think we were supposed to find her." "I think she's the reason we stopped running." Dora reached across and touched his hand. It was calloused and cold, but steady. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying we stop running. We take this," he lifted the letter, "and we go to Santa Fe. We tell them everything. They won't believe us," Dora said. "Maybe not. But we don't need belief. We need to be heard." Dora nodded slowly. "Then we ride at first light." Nahuel looked out into the night. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet dirt and sap. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled once long and low. "We ride," he said again. Far down the ridge, hidden beneath the trees, a different kind of predator crouched behind a rock, watching. He had seen their firelight for just a second before it went out. Long enough. He slid back into the brush and reached for the rifle strapped across his back. The report was due in the morning, and the hunt had just gotten serious. They reached Haven just as spring was finding its foothold in the highlands. Snow still clung to the mountain caps, but the valley below was beginning to warm. Wildflowers poked through dry grass. The river ran cold and fast, and the town itself, little more than a cluster of crooked buildings stitched together by necessity and grit, sat like a secret between two ridges. Haven was the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be asked questions. A place for start-overs and false names. A place where nobody cared what you were running from as long as you paid in coin, worked hard, and didn't bring trouble to the doorstep. Nahuel, Dora, and Lucy rode in mid-morning, dusty from weeks on the trail, their boots stiff with wear and their silence shared. They passed a few men hauling lumber, 2 women sweeping porches, and a boy with a busted shoe chasing a mule through the street. No one looked twice. Dora tilted her head toward the center of town. "It's quiet," she said. Nahuel's eyes scanned the edges of the street, the church steeple, the open stable, and the sagging sign that read Zimmer's Goods. He nodded. That's why we're here. They found a small house on the southern edge of town. The roof leaked in one corner, and the porch leaned sideways like it had gotten tired halfway through standing. But it had a front door that locked from the inside, and a backyard patch that Dora said would be good for vegetables once the frost let go. Nahuel paid 3 months' rent in advance, no questions asked. They told folks their name was Cooper. Nahuel was a scout from New Mexico, now working as a freelance guide for mining outfits and travelers headed through the pass. Dora was his wife, a seamstress with skill and patience. Lucy, their daughter, was 6 sharp, curious, and just starting school. The lies were easy because they weren't lies in the ways that mattered. Lucy started school that week. She wore her patched dress and the same blue shawl, though Dora had cleaned it so well it almost looked new. Her teacher, Miss Morrison, was a gentlewoman with tired eyes and a voice that soothed. She never asked where Lucy had come from, just gave her a desk and a pencil and told her the world was full of stories waiting to be written down. Dora rented a corner of the dry goods store to do tailoring. Within a month, her hands were busy from sunrise to sundown. People in Haven didn't care about her bloodline. They cared about stitches that held and hems that didn't tear. Nahuel kept mostly to the woods. He guided hunting parties up through the ridges or helped greenhorn prospectors avoid getting themselves killed. At night, he came home smelling of pine and sweat and sometimes game meat if he'd been lucky. Lucy would run to meet him, chattering about her day, and Dora would ask how the trail looked always with that quiet undercurrent of, was anyone asking about us? But for a while no one was. They found something close to peace. Mornings were filled with school lunches and garden planting, evenings with mending clothes, warming stew, and quiet talk under the flicker of lantern light. On Sundays, they went to church, not because they believed more than anyone else, but because it gave them a seat in the circle, a face in the crowd. Lucy laughed more now. She played with the neighbor boy, picked flowers behind the stable, learned to write her name in perfect block letters. Her nightmares came less often, and when they did, she no longer woke up screaming. Just crawled between Nahuel and Dora until sleep found her again. One evening, she stood at the window, watching the sky turn orange. "Do you think heaven looks like this?" she asked. Nahuel glanced at the horizon, then at her. "I think heaven looks like where you feel safe," he said. She thought for a moment. "Then I think I've been there all week." Dora turned away and wiped her eyes before anyone noticed. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed and the house was dark, someone knocked on the door. Nahuel opened it slowly, hand resting near the rifle by the frame. A messenger stood outside, a lanky boy no older than 15. "Letter came for a Mrs. Dora Thompson," he said. Dora stepped forward, her breath catching. "That's me." The boy looked confused but handed over the envelope and tipped his hat. "Came from Santa Fe. Passed through 3 towns before it got here. Man said it was important." She shut the door slowly, staring at the seal. Nahuel watched her from across the room. "You want me to open it?" Dora shook her head and sat down. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax. Inside was a note from a law office. The man who wrote it claimed to be the executor of Reverend Thompson's estate. He had passed 3 months prior, and in his final instructions had left something for Dora, something she had already once held but never dared to use. Enclosed was a second envelope, old, yellowed, sealed in the Reverend's wax. Inside, they both knew, were names, documents, testimonies, all connected to a conspiracy to steal land from native families through false deeds, bribes, and violence. Nahuel looked at her as she stared at the paper in her lap. "He kept it all this time," she said, "waited until it was safe." "Is it safe now?" he asked. She looked up at him. "No, But maybe it's time anyway. Across the room, the lamp flickered low. Lucy's soft breathing carried down the hallway. Nahuel reached for the envelope and turned it in his hands. The people in that letter, they're still out there. They're still powerful, Dora whispered. But so are we now, Nahuel said. We have a name, a life, a family, and something to lose. He nodded. All the more reason not to let it be taken. Outside, the wind shifted, and the trees beyond the yard swayed like they were listening. In the morning, they would sit at the kitchen table and read the contents aloud, line by line. And by evening, they would decide whether to keep the past buried or ride toward the truth. Morning light poured across the kitchen table like honey, slow and golden. Outside, birds called to each other through the garden fence, and Lucy's laughter echoed faintly from the backyard where she was chasing a butterfly through the damp grass. Inside, the mood was heavier. Nahuel sat with his elbows resting on the scarred wooden table. Dora sat across from him, holding the opened envelope in both hands like it might vanish if she let go. Between them lay a stack of documents, folded maps, signed statements, faded letters, and legal claims yellowed with time. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, like a thunderstorm building in the distance. They never expected this to surface again, Dora said finally, voice low and tight. Not after so many years. Not from me, Nahuel unfolded one of the papers, a surveyor's map, hand-drawn, with clear boundaries marked in ink. Dozens of parcels labeled with Apache clan names, inked out and rewritten with English surnames in another hand. Who signed these? He asked. She pulled another sheet from the pile and slid it across. Samuel Ryland. Nahuel's eyes darkened. That name wasn't just paper to him. It was the name of the man who had promised Dora to marriage like she was a prize pig. The one who'd expanded his freight business into 3 territories in under a decade. The one whose reach stretched far beyond storefronts and contracts. And now Nahuel saw why. He built it on stolen land, Nahuel said. On our land. Dora nodded. And when my father refused to go along with the falsified filings, they made him disappear. Reverend Thompson suspected as much. That's why he kept this. She tapped the document in Nahuel's hand, a notarized letter from her father, naming Ryland and 2 territorial officials as orchestrators of a scheme to seize native land under the guise of abandonment and forfeiture. He died for this, Dora whispered, and now it's in our hands. Nahuel leaned back, his face carved in stillness. If this is real, it is. Then it could burn half the territory down. Dora met his eyes. Then maybe it needs to. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of the clock above the stove. They both knew what came next. Santa Fe. Bringing these documents to the capital would mean handing their lives over to the winds. It meant risking exposure, retaliation, maybe worse. The people named in the files were not just men with businesses. They were judges, land agents, militia officers, men who had shaped law to their liking for 20 years. Nahuel stood and crossed to the window. Lucy was twirling in a patch of sun, her shawl trailing behind her like a kite tail. She's happy here, he said. She's also still a fugitive, Dora replied. And so are we. He looked over his shoulder. We could stay. Keep quiet. No one would ever know, no one except us, Dora said. And every Apache child that grows up thinking the land they walk on never belonged to them. Every girl like me who thinks silence is the safest path. Nahuel turned fully, walking back to the table. He placed his hands flat on the wood and looked down at the documents. They'll come for us if we do this. They'll come for us if we don't. A long silence passed between them, stretched taut with weight. And then Lucy's voice called through the window. Can I bring my butterfly inside? Dora smiled sadly. only if it wants to stay. That night, they packed only what they could carry on horseback. Dora rolled the documents into a tight leather tube, wrapped it in canvas, and tied it beneath her coat. Nahuel cleaned his rifle, sharpened his knife, and filled the saddlebags with dried meat and hard bread. Lucy packed her shawl, her 2 books, and the wooden sparrow Nahuel had carved for her. They didn't tell anyone goodbye. No one in Haven knew enough to miss them properly. Before dawn, the family of 3 rode out through the mist, the peaks above still wrapped in snow. Haven disappeared behind them, swallowed by fog and memory. They didn't look back. Half a day later, a rider arrived in Haven. Clean boots, polished revolver, a badge tucked inside his vest. He went straight to Zimmer's store, asked too many questions, and listened too closely. By the time he rode out again, he knew enough. He knew their names. He knew their story. And more importantly, he knew they were headed to Santa Fe. He reached for the small black notebook in his saddlebag and scribbled a single sentence. They're riding with fire in their hands. Then he turned his horse east, toward the men who would pay any price to stop that fire from spreading. The courthouse in Santa Fe stood like an old sentinel against the winter sky, its sandstone walls cracked, its wood-framed windows dusted with frost. And yet, on that morning, it breathed with purpose. Carriages crowded the front steps. Reporters from across the territory stood shoulder to shoulder, their notebooks damp with fog, their eyes sharp for scandal. Justice, for once, was drawing a crowd. Inside, Dora adjusted Lucy's collar and kissed the top of her head before sending her to the wooden bench along the back wall. Lucy clutched her schoolbooks against her chest, wearing her best green dress and the copper hairpin Nahuel had carved from a bullet casing. She looked small beneath the soaring ceiling beams, but her gaze was steady. Nahuel stood beside Dora in front of the courtroom's long pine table, where a gray-haired man in black robes leaned slightly forward in his chair. Judge William Harrison had seen 70 winters, and it showed in his brittle hands and furrowed brow. But when he spoke, the room hushed like wind retreating from a canyon wall. "You have documents," he said. "Let's see what ghosts you've carried here." Dora stepped forward first. Her voice never trembled as she laid each sheet out before the judge: land maps, title transfers, sworn letters, notarized testimonies from dead men. Each page a thread, and together a noose around the necks of those who had stolen and lied and murdered under the banner of law. Nahuel followed with the final blow. A signed confession from a land surveyor who had fled to Mexico years ago, now returned under the promise of protection. His affidavit named names Ryland, Judge Kessler, 2 land commissioners, a sheriff, and even a delegate to Congress. The courtroom rustled like a shaken beehive. People turned to each other, whispering names like poison passing hand to hand. And then Judge Harrison said quietly, "Call in the marshals." Within the hour, federal officers swarmed half the town. Samuel Ryland was dragged from his parlor mid-whiskey. Judge Kessler was taken in front of his congregation. One of the land agents attempted to flee through the train yard and was arrested before he could bribe a conductor. Their bank accounts were frozen. Land titles nullified. Control shifted in an instant, and the system they'd built like a fortress now cracked from its foundation upward. By the second day, the courthouse was surrounded by newsmen. Headlines hit the wire. Massive land theft ring exposed in New Mexico. Widow and Apache guide uncover scandal reaching capital. Child witness key to unraveling decades-old conspiracy. Dora refused interviews. So did Nahuel. They had not come for fame, only for peace. On the 3rd day, Lucy climbed the courthouse steps in her school uniform and stood before Judge Harrison. He looked down at her gently. "You were there," he said. She nodded. "I saw the men. I remember their faces, and I remember what they called Nahuel. It wasn't his name. You understand this testimony may shape the case. I'm not afraid. The judge smiled, faint and tired. You remind me of someone I once knew. A girl who wouldn't sit down when the world told her to. The trial itself lasted 3 weeks, but the judgment came on a bright February morning when the sun finally cracked the cold. Judge Harrison read from a paper with steady hands. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. All land seized under fraudulent filings is to be returned to the Apache tribal register. All defendants named in the conspiracy shall be prosecuted to the fullest extent. The state shall fund restitution, and then softer. To Miss Dora Middleton and Mr. Nahuel, your courage has restored what the law should never have taken. May your lives now be your own. Nahuel sat still as a stone. Dora reached over and placed her hand on his. They had not smiled. Not yet. Not quite. But something inside them loosened. And for the first time in many years, it did not feel like hope was a lie. Outside, Lucy danced down the courthouse steps like a girl who just passed her final exam. She waved to Nahuel as he emerged, and he waved back, one hand on his hat, the other resting lightly on Dora's shoulder. They did not speak of what came next. Not until that night when Dora pulled a letter from her coat pocket, a new envelope, delivered not to them, but to Judge Harrison. She handed it to Nahuel without a word. He opened it under the firelight. Inside was a single sheet, an anonymous warning. Not everyone has fallen. One more name remains, one more who has not forgotten. He is coming. The road back to Haven was half-melted snow and soft red clay, the kind that clung to boots and slowed wagon wheels. But none of them complained. The sun peeked from behind the clouds, and ahead, beyond the bend in the cottonwood grove, the roof of their little house appeared slanted, familiar, waiting. Lucy was the first to jump down from the wagon. Her shoes hit the frozen mud, and in seconds she was sprinting across the yard, arms spread wide like a bird coming home. "It's still here," she shouted, throwing open the crooked gate. "Everything's still here." The old porch creaked beneath her steps. The windows were dusty but unbroken, the door still painted blue, the lamp still hanging from its hook like a memory caught in midair. Dora followed, her coat dusted in travel, her braid now streaked with silver. She stepped onto the porch and ran her hand along the weathered beam beside the door, then paused and smiled at the faded etching in the wood. Lucy's name, carved by Nahuel one spring evening long ago. Inside, the hearth stood cold, but the chairs were right where they'd left them. The patchwork quilt Dora had made still sat folded on the couch. She opened the kitchen cabinets and found the old cast-iron pot, dented and perfect. Within minutes she had a fire going and a stew simmering, the smell of garlic and beans warming the air. The clatter of spoons, the hiss of water boiling, the soft hum of a woman who no longer feared shadows. Lucy moved through every room, her fingertips brushing walls like she was checking for ghosts and finding none. Outside, Nahuel stood on the porch, one boot on the step, hands in his pockets. Snowflakes floated down like drifting ash, melting against the brim of his hat. He stared across the land that once held their fear. Now it held only peace. Dora stepped outside and joined him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. "No," he said, "but I think we've finally earned the right to stop running." Behind them, Lucy appeared in the doorway. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her smile brighter than the lantern now glowing in the window behind her. She leaned on the door frame. "Are we home now?" Dora reached for her hand, squeezed it. "Yes, baby. We're not running anymore." They sat down together at the wooden table that night, under the soft glow of the hanging lamp. The stew was hot, the bread warm, the blankets thick across their knees. Snow piled gently outside the windows, but inside it was quiet, solid, the kind of quiet that hums in your bones and makes you believe things might just hold. Lucy dozed off in the rocking chair, arms wrapped around a worn book. Dora tucked a quilt around her. Now Wells stood by the window, watching the last snowflakes fall. His voice came low, more breath than sound. "Maybe heaven isn't where the dead go," he said. "Maybe it's what you build with those you love." Dora looked up at him, her eyes reflecting firelight. And for the first time in years there was no echo of boots behind them, no cold knock at the door, no names to change, just this wind outside, warmth inside, and the family they chose. But outside the frame of their quiet night, far beyond Haven's border, another letter was being written, another name whispered, another past unburied. Because justice may find rest, but evil never does. So if you believe in second chances, in quiet courage, in families built not by blood, but by choice, then don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to Western Legacy to follow the next journey, and remember, sometimes heaven is not a place. It's a promise you keep.